The dinner rush had already started when the restaurant doors opened for another busy evening. Plates moved quickly from the kitchen, servers walked carefully between crowded tables, and soft music played in the background. It was one of the most popular restaurants in the city, a place where successful business owners, visitors, and wealthy families often came to spend their evenings. Among all the employees working that night was a young waitress. She moved quietly through the dining room, carrying trays, taking orders, and helping customers with a gentle smile. Most people hardly noticed her. She was not the loudest server, nor was she the one constantly chatting with guests. She simply focused on her work and treated everyone with kindness. Many customers came and went without ever learning her story. Every morning, she woke up before sunrise in a small apartment she shared with her elderly mother. Life had never been easy for them. Money was always tight, and every paycheck mattered. The young woman worked long hours to cover rent, food, medicine, and other daily expenses. Despite the challenges, she rarely complained. Her mother often worried about her. "You work too hard," she would say. The young waitress would smile and gently shake her head. Then she would prepare breakfast before leaving for work. There was one thing about her that strangers immediately noticed. Speaking was difficult for her. Since childhood, she had lived with a speech condition that made it hard for her to communicate clearly. Some words came out slowly. Others were difficult to pronounce at all. Because of this, many people assumed she lacked confidence or intelligence. They were wrong. She understood far more than people realized. Over the years, she had learned that some people were patient and kind. Others were not. Some listened carefully. Others laughed. Because of these experiences, she had become quiet. Not because she wanted to be, but because silence often felt safer. At the restaurant, most of her coworkers respected her. They knew she worked harder than almost anyone else. Whenever someone needed help, she was there. If a new employee felt nervous, she encouraged them. If the kitchen became overwhelmed, she stepped in without being asked. Her kindness made a difference. Even on difficult days, she found small reasons to smile. What nobody at the restaurant fully understood was that she carried a secret passion inside her heart. She loved music. More than anything else in the world, she loved music. As a child, she would sit beside an old radio for hours, listening carefully to every song. She could not sing the way others did, but she felt every note deeply. Music spoke to her in a way words never could. While other children played outside, she often stood in front of a mirror, moving her hands and expressions along with songs. She learned how emotions could be communicated without speaking. Happiness, sadness, hope, excitement. She practiced showing all of them through movement and expression. Over time, it became more than a hobby. It became part of who she was. Whenever life became difficult, music gave her comfort. Whenever she felt misunderstood, music reminded her that emotions could still be shared. Late at night, after long shifts at the restaurant, she often returned home and spent time practicing alone. Her mother would watch quietly from a nearby chair. Sometimes tears appeared in her eyes, not because she was sad, because she was proud. She knew how much courage it took for her daughter to keep believing in herself after years of being judged by others. Yet outside their apartment, very few people knew about this hidden talent. At work, she remained simply the quiet waitress. One afternoon, a coworker accidentally discovered her secret. The restaurant had closed for a short break between lunch and dinner service. Most employees were either eating, checking their phones, or resting before the evening rush. The young waitress thought she was alone in a small storage area near the back of the building. Music played softly from her phone. She moved her hands gracefully while following the lyrics. Her face reflected every emotion in the song. She was completely focused and unaware that someone had entered the hallway. The coworker stood there quietly for several moments, watching, surprised. When the song ended, the coworker finally stepped forward. The waitress immediately became embarrassed. She tried to explain herself, but the coworker smiled. "That was beautiful," the coworker said. The young woman looked down, unsure how to respond. The coworker asked if she had ever performed for an audience. She quickly shook her head. The thought seemed impossible. People like her did not stand on stages. At least that was what she had always believed. The coworker did not argue but never forgot what had been seen that day. As weeks passed, life continued normally. The restaurant remained busy. Customers arrived. Customers left. Nothing seemed unusual. Then one morning, the manager gathered everyone for an important meeting. A major event had been booked for the following weekend. Several influential business leaders would be attending a private dinner at the restaurant. Important guests from different companies were expected to arrive. The event could bring valuable publicity and future opportunities. Everyone needed to perform at their best. The staff listened carefully. Extra preparations began immediately. Tables were polished. Decorations were arranged. Menus were reviewed. Every detail mattered. As the special evening approached, excitement spread throughout the restaurant. Employees talked about the guests who would be attending. One particular guest attracted more attention than anyone else. He was a wealthy businessman known throughout the region. His companies employed hundreds of people. His name frequently appeared in local news reports. People often described him as powerful, successful, and demanding. Stories about him circulated everywhere. Some admired him. Others feared him. According to rumors, he expected perfection from everyone around him and rarely showed patience when things went wrong. The staff hoped the evening would pass smoothly. Nobody wanted problems. The young waitress listened to the conversations but paid little attention. Wealthy guests came and went all the time. She planned to do what she always did, work hard and treat customers respectfully. Still, she felt nervous about the event. Important guests often meant extra pressure. The night finally arrived. The restaurant looked more elegant than ever. Crystal glasses reflected warm light. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Employees wore their best uniforms. As luxury cars began arriving outside, anticipation filled the air. Guests entered one after another. Laughter and conversation spread across the dining room. Everything seemed perfect. The young waitress welcomed customers, delivered menus, and helped wherever needed. She focused on each task carefully. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Then the wealthy businessman arrived. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Several guests greeted him warmly. The manager personally welcomed him. Employees straightened their posture as he walked through the restaurant. His expensive suit and confident expression made him stand out from everyone around him. He took his seat at a prominent table near the center of the room. Business associates joined him. Important discussions soon began. The waitress noticed the table had been assigned to her section. A small feeling of nervousness appeared in her stomach. She reminded herself to stay calm. It was just another table. Just another customer. Nothing more. With a polite smile, she approached and prepared to take their orders. At that moment, she had no idea that this guest would soon change the course of her life. She could not know that one painful moment was waiting just ahead. She could not know that the hidden talent she had spent years protecting would soon be seen by everyone. For now, she simply stood beside the table, holding her notepad, ready to serve. The busy restaurant continued buzzing around her. Conversations filled the room. Glasses clinked softly. Music played in the background. And the first chapter of an unforgettable story was about to begin. The young waitress stood beside the table with her notepad in hand. The wealthy businessman barely looked at her when she greeted him. His attention remained fixed on the people sitting around him. She waited patiently. Finally, he glanced up. Without returning her smile, he ordered a meal and several drinks for the table. The others followed, adding their own requests. She carefully wrote everything down and repeated the order to make sure it was correct. One of the drinks was a special item that was only available in limited quantities. The businessman nodded impatiently. "Just make sure nothing is wrong," he said. The waitress politely acknowledged him and headed toward the kitchen. First, everything seemed normal. The kitchen staff prepared the meals quickly. Servers moved back and forth carrying trays. Guests continued enjoying the event. But on busy nights, even the best restaurants faced small problems. When the waitress returned with the drinks, she learned that the special beverage the businessman had ordered was no longer available. Another server had unknowingly served the last one to a different table moments earlier. The manager was informed immediately. A replacement option was prepared. The waitress took a deep breath and walked back to the table. She knew some customers would understand. Others would not. As she approached, the businessman was in the middle of an important conversation. The people around him were listening closely. When she politely explained the situation, his expression changed. "What do you mean it's unavailable?" he asked. His voice was louder than before. The nearby tables began noticing. The waitress calmly explained again and offered several alternatives. The businessman leaned back in his chair. "That's unbelievable." She remained polite. "I'm very sorry, sir." The businessman laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For a restaurant that charges these prices, I expected better service." Several guests at the table looked uncomfortable. One of them quietly suggested choosing another drink. But the businessman wasn't finished. He looked directly at the waitress. "Did you not understand the order properly?" The question immediately made her nervous. Because of her speech condition, situations like this were always difficult. She carefully tried to respond. Her words came out slower than she wanted. The businessman noticed. A small smirk appeared on his face. For a moment, the entire table became silent. The waitress felt every eye in the room turning toward her. She tried explaining again. Her voice trembled slightly. The businessman exchanged looks with another guest. Then he shook his head. "Maybe someone else should handle this table." The comment wasn't shouted. In some ways, that made it worse. The people nearby could still hear it. The waitress felt heat rising in her face. She wanted to disappear. Still, she kept her composure. "I apologize," she said softly. One of the guests attempted to ease the tension. "It's just a drink. Let's move on." But the businessman seemed irritated by the attention. Instead of ending the conversation, he continued. "You know, communication is important in this job." The words hung in the air. Everyone understood what he was implying. The waitress lowered her eyes. Years of experience had taught her that arguing rarely helped. Some people made judgments before they knew anything about her. Nothing she said would change their minds. At a nearby table, a couple stopped eating and watched. Several staff members noticed the exchange from a distance. The manager looked concerned but was occupied with another issue across the room. The businessman took a sip of water. Then he spoke again. "If you can't handle simple requests, maybe this isn't the right line of work." The statement landed like a stone. Nobody laughed. Nobody agreed. The dining room suddenly felt smaller. The waitress stood frozen for a second, not because she didn't know what to say, because she knew there was nothing she could say. Any response would only make the situation worse. So she did what she had always done when faced with cruelty. She remained calm. "Would you like me to bring another selection?" she asked politely. The businessman stared at her. Perhaps he expected anger. Perhaps he expected tears. Instead, he found professionalism. That seemed to frustrate him even more. One of his business associates finally stepped in. "Let's continue with dinner." Thankfully, the conversation shifted. The waitress quietly left the table. As she walked away, she could feel dozens of eyes following her. The embarrassment settled heavily inside her chest. In the service hallway, she stopped for a moment. She wasn't crying. She had learned long ago how to control those emotions in public. But the comments still hurt. They always did. No matter how strong she tried to be. A fellow server approached her. "Are you okay?" She nodded. The coworker wasn't convinced. That was unfair. The waitress forced a small smile. Then she returned to work. The night wasn't over. Bills still needed to be paid. Customers still needed service. She couldn't afford to let one person ruin everything. For the next hour, she focused on her duties. She delivered meals, refilled glasses, cleared tables, helped guests. Most customers treated her kindly, just as they always had. Yet the earlier incident remained in the back of her mind. Each time she passed the businessman's table, she felt a knot in her stomach. The businessman, meanwhile, appeared completely unaffected. He laughed with his guests, discussed deals, accepted compliments. To everyone watching from a distance, he looked successful and confident. But confidence and kindness are not always the same thing. As the evening continued, something unexpected happened. Several customers who had witnessed the exchange quietly approached the waitress. One elderly woman touched her arm gently. "You handled that very well." The waitress thanked her. A younger guest offered a supportive smile. Another customer left an encouraging note on a napkin. The simple acts of kindness meant more than they realized. They reminded her that not everyone judged people unfairly. Not everyone looked down on others. Still, the pain from earlier lingered. Near the end of dinner service, the manager finally had a chance to speak with her. He had heard what happened. "I should have stepped in sooner," he said. The waitress quickly shook her head. She didn't want anyone getting into trouble because of her. The manager sighed. "Nobody deserves to be treated that way." Before she could respond, another employee rushed over. There was a new problem. The entertainer scheduled for the evening event had just called. A family emergency had forced the performer to cancel. The news spread quickly among the staff. The manager looked stunned. "What do you mean canceled?" The employee explained that the performer would not be arriving. The event schedule was now missing its featured entertainment. The manager rubbed his forehead. The timing couldn't have been worse. Many guests were expecting a performance after dinner. Without it, the evening might end awkwardly. The staff gathered briefly to discuss possible solutions. Nobody had an answer. Hiring another performer at the last minute seemed impossible. The manager paced back and forth. Meanwhile, the waitress quietly continued working. She assumed the problem had nothing to do with her. Then one coworker suddenly spoke up. A thought had entered their mind. At first, they weren't sure whether to mention it. But the more they considered it, the more it made sense. The coworker looked at the manager. "I might know someone." The manager immediately stopped pacing. "Who?" The coworker glanced toward the waitress. She was collecting empty plates nearby and didn't realize they were talking about her. The manager followed the coworker's gaze. Confusion appeared on his face. The coworker smiled slightly. "You remember what I told you a few weeks ago?" The manager thought for a moment. Then realization slowly appeared. "The music." The coworker nodded. The manager looked surprised. He had nearly forgotten that conversation. The waitress finally noticed them looking at her. She seemed puzzled. The manager walked over. "There may be something I'd like to ask you." The young woman looked nervous immediately. "What is it?" she asked softly. The manager exchanged a glance with the coworker. Then he carefully explained the situation. As she listened, her eyes widened. Surely they couldn't be serious. There was no way they were asking what she thought they were asking. But they were. The manager's next words left her speechless. "Would you consider performing tonight?" For a moment, she thought she had misunderstood. Perform? In front of all these people? The same people who had just watched her being humiliated? The same guests filling the crowded dining room? Her heart began beating faster. She looked toward the businessman's table. He was still sitting there, still talking, still completely unaware of what was about to happen. And neither the waitress nor anyone else in that room could imagine how dramatically the rest of the evening was about to change. The waitress stared at the manager, convinced she had heard him wrong. "Perform tonight?" she asked quietly. The manager nodded. "I know it's unexpected," he said, "but we need help. The entertainer canceled, and several guests are expecting a performance after dinner." She immediately shook her head. There was no way. Not in front of all these people. Not after what had happened earlier. The memory of the businessman's comments was still fresh in her mind. She could still hear his voice. She could still feel the embarrassment of standing in front of everyone while he questioned her abilities. The thought of walking onto a stage now felt impossible. The coworker who had suggested her stepped closer. "You don't have to sing," the coworker said gently. "Just do what you showed me." The waitress looked away. That had been different. Practicing alone was one thing. Standing before a room full of strangers was something else entirely. "What if people laugh?" she asked. Neither the manager nor the coworker answered immediately. It was an honest question. The truth was that nobody could guarantee how people would react. The manager finally spoke. "Then they laugh." She looked surprised. He continued, "But what if they don't?" The waitress remained silent. The manager crossed his arms. "I've watched you work here for years. You show up every day. You treat people kindly. You handle difficult situations better than most people would." He paused. "I think you're stronger than you realize." His words stayed with her. Strong. Nobody had called her that before. Most people saw her speech condition and immediately assumed weakness. They never saw the effort behind every conversation. They never saw the courage it took just to face strangers every day. The manager continued, "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it." Then he returned to handling the event. The coworker gave her an encouraging smile before walking away. The waitress stood alone for a moment. Her heart felt heavy. Part of her wanted to refuse immediately. That would be easier, safer. Nobody could judge her if she never stepped onto the stage. But another part of her felt something different. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. A small spark of possibility. The evening continued around her. Guests laughed. Servers carried food. Conversations filled the restaurant. Yet her mind remained focused on one question. Should she do it? As she worked, memories from her childhood began returning. She remembered sitting beside the old radio in her family's small home. She remembered listening to songs for hours. She remembered watching performers on television and imagining what it would feel like to stand before an audience. Back then, she had dreamed big. Before life taught her to be careful. Before people convinced her to stay quiet. Before she started believing that certain opportunities belonged only to other people. The manager's words continued echoing in her mind. What if they don't laugh? The question followed her through every task. Eventually, the dinner service began winding down. Most guests had finished eating. The scheduled performance time was approaching quickly. The manager looked increasingly nervous. Without entertainment, the event would end on a disappointing note. Finally, he approached her once more. "No pressure," he said, "but I need an answer." The waitress looked around the room. Her eyes settled briefly on the businessman's table. He was still there, still talking confidently, still unaware of the impact his words had left behind. For a second, she imagined walking away. She could finish her shift and go home. Nobody would blame her. Nobody expected anything from her. Then she thought about her mother. Her mother had spent years encouraging her to stop hiding, to stop letting fear make decisions for her. "You don't need a voice to be heard," her mother often said. The memory brought a small smile to her face. The waitress took a slow breath. Then she looked at the manager. "I'll do it." The manager blinked. "Really?" She nodded. For the first time all evening, excitement appeared on his face. "Thank you." Almost immediately, preparations began. A small stage area had already been set up for the original entertainer. The sound equipment was ready. The lighting was ready. Everything was in place. The only thing missing was a performer. Now they had one. Word spread quietly among a few staff members. Many were surprised. Others were curious. Several co-workers gathered around to offer encouragement. "You'll be great. You can do this. We're all rooting for you." Their support helped, but the nervousness remained. As the minutes passed, her anxiety grew stronger. What if she forgot her movements? What if she froze? What if the audience simply didn't understand what she was trying to express? The doubts arrived one after another. Yet she kept moving forward. There was no turning back now. The manager helped select a song. It was one she knew well. A song filled with emotion, hope, and perseverance. The kind of song that meant something. The kind of song she had practiced countless times at home. While final preparations were being made, she slipped into a quiet room behind the restaurant. For a few minutes, she was completely alone. The noise from the dining room felt distant. She sat down in a chair and closed her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't afraid of performing. Not exactly. She was afraid of being seen. Really seen. For years, she had hidden the most important part of herself. The part that loved music. The part that communicated through emotion instead of words. Tonight, that hidden part would be standing under bright lights. Exposed to everyone. Including the man who had humiliated her. The thought made her stomach tighten. She reached into her bag and looked at an old photograph she always carried. It showed her and her mother years earlier. Both were smiling. The picture reminded her why she worked so hard. Why she kept going. Why she never gave up. She took a deep breath. Then another. Gradually, the fear began settling. Not disappearing. Just becoming manageable. A knock came at the door. It was the coworker. "They're ready." The waitress stood. Her heart immediately started racing again. Together they walked toward the stage area. The closer they got, the louder the crowd sounded. Guests were gathering their attention. Some were checking their phones. Others were finishing conversations. Nobody expected anything unusual. Certainly not what was about to happen. The manager stepped onto the stage. He welcomed everyone and thanked them for attending the event. Then he explained that there had been a last-minute change in the evening's entertainment. A few guests exchanged curious looks. The businessman glanced up briefly from his conversation. The manager smiled. "I'd like to introduce someone very special." The waitress waited behind the curtain. Her hands felt cold. Every instinct told her to run. But she stayed. The manager continued speaking. "Sometimes the most remarkable people are the ones we overlook." Several guests looked interested. The room gradually became quieter. The manager then stepped aside. The waitress heard her cue. For one final second, she remained frozen. Then she remembered her mother's words. "You don't need a voice to be heard." She took a breath, lifted her head, and walked onto the stage. The room fell silent. Many guests immediately recognized her. Confused expressions appeared across the audience. Some whispered to one another. Others leaned forward in their seats. Even the businessman looked surprised. He clearly hadn't expected to see the waitress standing under the spotlight. The waitress felt hundreds of eyes watching her. The pressure was overwhelming. For a brief moment, fear threatened to take over completely. Then the music began. A single piano note echoed through the room. Then another. The melody slowly filled the air. The waitress closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them again, something inside her had changed. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She raised her hands. The audience watched closely. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And as the first moments of the performance began, not a single person in that restaurant realized they were about to witness something they would never forget. The first notes of the piano melody drifted through the restaurant. The waitress stood alone beneath the soft spotlight. For a brief moment, nobody knew what to expect. The guests looked at one another with curiosity. Some remembered her as the quiet server who had been moving between tables all evening. Others recognized her as the young woman who had been embarrassed earlier by the wealthy businessman. No one understood why she had been invited onto the stage. Then she slowly raised her hands. The room became even quieter. There were no microphones near her. No lyrics appeared on a screen. No introduction explained what she was about to do. There was only music. And her. As the melody continued, she began moving her hands gently with the rhythm. Her expressions changed naturally with each emotion in the song. At first, a few people seemed confused. They expected singing. Instead, they saw something completely different. But within moments, that confusion began to disappear. Because what she was doing needed no explanation. Every movement carried meaning. Every expression told part of a story. Without speaking a single word, she was communicating more than many people ever could with their voices. The audience leaned forward. The conversations stopped. Even the waiters carrying trays slowed down to watch. The music continued building. The waitress moved with confidence she didn't even know she possessed. The nervousness that had overwhelmed her backstage slowly faded away. For the first time all evening, she wasn't thinking about who was watching. She wasn't thinking about judgment. She wasn't thinking about mistakes. She was simply sharing something she loved. And that made all the difference. Her hands moved gracefully through the air. Her eyes reflected every feeling within the song. Hope, loss, determination, joy. The emotions flowed naturally from one moment to the next. Many guests found themselves unexpectedly drawn into the performance. Felt personal, real, human. One woman sitting near the stage quietly lowered her phone and simply watched. A man at another table folded his arms and stared with complete attention. Several guests who had been checking emails moments earlier now ignored their screens entirely. Something special was happening. People could feel it. The businessman watched too. At first, his expression showed mild curiosity. Then surprise. Then something else. Confusion. He remembered the waitress from earlier. The same young woman he had criticized. The same person he had dismissed. Yet the person standing on the stage seemed completely different from the one he thought he knew. The confidence, the grace, the emotion, none of it matched the image he had created in his mind. The music shifted into a more powerful section. The waitress followed perfectly. Her movements became stronger, more expressive, more emotional. The audience remained completely silent. Not because they were uninterested, because they didn't want to miss a single moment. Near the back of the room, the manager stood watching with amazement. Even he hadn't expected this. He knew she had talent, but seeing it in front of a live audience was something else entirely. The coworker who had first discovered her hidden ability smiled proudly. They remembered finding her practicing alone weeks earlier. Back then, nobody imagined she would one day stand before a room full of influential guests. Yet here she was, captivating every person in attendance. The song continued. The waitress felt herself becoming completely immersed in the performance. Years of practice were finally finding their purpose. All those nights spent standing in front of a mirror. All those hours learning how to communicate emotion through movement. All those moments when she felt invisible. They had led her here. For years, she had hidden this part of herself. Not because she was ashamed, because she feared rejection. Now, for the first time, she wasn't hiding anymore. The realization gave her even more confidence. As the music reached another emotional peak, she poured everything into the performance. The audience responded immediately. People weren't just watching. They were feeling. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes. An older gentleman nodded slowly, as if he understood every emotion being expressed. Several guests began recording videos. Not because they planned to post them online. Because they wanted to remember what they were witnessing. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had completely changed. Earlier, the room had been filled with business conversations and formal networking. Now it felt different. Warmer. More connected. More genuine. For a little while, job titles and social status no longer mattered. Everyone was simply part of the same audience, sharing the same experience. The businessman shifted in his chair. For the first time that evening, he seemed uncomfortable. Not because of the performance, because of what it was making him realize. Earlier, he had judged the waitress based on a few brief interactions. He had assumed he understood who she was. Now he was watching proof that he had been wrong. Very wrong. The performance continued. The waitress never once looked directly at him. She wasn't performing for revenge. She wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. She wasn't trying to prove a point. She was simply expressing herself. That honesty made the performance even more powerful. Nothing about it felt forced. Nothing felt artificial. Every movement came from the heart. And the audience could tell. As the song moved toward its final section, the energy inside the room became almost impossible to describe. People sat motionless, listening, watching, feeling every second. The waitress herself seemed transformed. The shy server who usually kept her head down had disappeared. In her place stood someone fearless, someone strong, someone who no longer seemed afraid of being seen. The final verse approached. The music softened. The The pace slowed. The audience remained completely silent. Not a glass clinked. Not a chair moved. The entire restaurant appeared frozen in time. The waitress closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The final moments of the song began. She performed them with remarkable emotion. Years of struggle. Years of self-doubt. Years of being misunderstood. It all seemed to pour into those final movements. The audience felt it, even without words, especially without words. When the final note played, she lowered her hands slowly. The music faded. Silence followed. For one long second, nobody moved. The waitress stood beneath the spotlight, breathing heavily, unsure what would happen next. The silence felt endless. Then someone started clapping. One person, then another, then another. Within moments, the entire room erupted. Applause filled every corner of the restaurant. People rose from their seats. More guests stood, then more. Soon, nearly everyone in the room was standing. The applause became thunderous. The waitress stared at the audience in disbelief. She had hoped they might like it. She had never imagined this. Tears appeared in her eyes, not from sadness, from relief. For years she had worried that people would never understand her. Tonight they did. Without speaking a single word, she had connected with an entire room full of strangers. The standing ovation continued. Several guests cheered. Others wiped away tears. The manager smiled broadly. The staff applauded from the sides of the room. The coworker who believed in her from the beginning looked emotional. Even the businessman was clapping. Slowly, quietly, but he was clapping. His expression was very different now. The confidence he had displayed earlier was gone. In its place was reflection. The waitress noticed none of this. At that moment, she was focused only on the audience and the overwhelming kindness they were showing her. The applause finally began to settle, but the impact of what had happened remained. The performance was over, yet the evening was far from finished, because in the next few minutes, guests would begin asking questions. Questions about who she was, questions about her story, and when the truth finally came out, the performance that had already touched so many hearts would become even more unforgettable. The applause continued long after the music ended. The waitress stood beneath the spotlight, overwhelmed by emotions she could barely process. Just a few hours earlier, she had been serving food quietly between tables. Now an entire room of strangers was standing and applauding her. She never expected anything like this. For several seconds, she simply stood there, trying to take it all in. The audience slowly began returning to their seats, but the excitement remained. People continued talking about the performance. Many guests were smiling. Others seemed emotional. Some were still holding their phones, replaying short videos they had recorded. The atmosphere inside the restaurant felt completely different from earlier in the evening. The manager stepped onto the stage. He waited for the applause to settle before speaking. "Thank you," he said. "I think we all just witnessed something very special." The audience responded with another round of applause. The waitress smiled shyly. She wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. But for once, the attention felt kind. A woman seated near the front raised her hand. "How long has she been performing?" The manager glanced toward the waitress. She looked nervous immediately. The manager understood. He knew she wasn't someone who enjoyed talking about herself. Still, he felt the audience deserved to know a little about the person they had just watched. "Actually," he said, "she isn't a professional performer." Several guests looked surprised. The manager continued, "She works here." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Many people already knew that, but hearing it confirmed made the story even more remarkable. The manager smiled. "Most days, she's serving tables, helping customers, and making sure everyone has a good experience." One guest shook his head in disbelief. Another guest smiled warmly. The manager wasn't finished. "What many people don't know is that she spent years developing this talent on her own." The audience listened carefully. The waitress lowered her eyes, feeling slightly embarrassed by all the attention. But the manager spoke with genuine respect. Life hasn't always been easy for her. The room remained quiet. She has faced challenges that many people would find difficult. Yet she never stopped working hard. She never stopped helping others. And she never gave up on the thing she loved most. The audience immediately understood. Nobody needed a long explanation. They had already seen enough to recognize her strength. The applause returned once more. This time it felt even more personal. Not because of her performance, because of her story. The waitress felt tears gathering in her eyes again. For years she had worried that people only noticed her limitations. Tonight they were seeing something else. They were seeing her determination. As the event continued, guests began approaching the stage area. Many wanted to meet her. Others simply wanted to thank her. One elderly man introduced himself. "That performance reminded me of my daughter," he said softly. The waitress smiled. The man continued. "She faced challenges too. Watching you tonight reminded me how strong people can be." The waitress thanked him. Another guest approached. Then another. Then another. Soon a small line had formed. Everyone seemed to have something kind to say. One woman explained that she had nearly canceled her attendance at the event because she was having a difficult week. "Your performance helped me more than you know," she said. The waitress felt genuinely touched. She never imagined her performance could affect people this way. To her, it had simply been an expression of emotion. Yet somehow it had connected with strangers from completely different backgrounds. Across the room, the businessman remained seated. For the first time all evening, he wasn't leading conversations. He wasn't telling stories. He wasn't commanding attention. Instead, he sat quietly, watching, thinking. The events of the night kept replaying in his mind. The interaction at dinner, his comments, the performance, the standing ovation. The contrast was impossible to ignore. He had judged someone without understanding anything about them. Now that realization felt uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, several guests continued gathering around the waitress. A local business owner complimented her courage. A teacher thanked her for being an example of perseverance. A retired musician praised the emotional depth of her performance. Each conversation added to the growing sense that something meaningful had happened. Not just entertainment, inspiration. Eventually, the crowd began thinning. The event was slowly coming to an end. Guests collected their belongings and prepared to leave. Many stopped to say goodbye before exiting. Some shook her hand. Others offered encouraging words. A few asked whether she planned to perform again. The question surprised her. Perform again? Until tonight, she had never seriously considered it. Yet now the idea no longer felt impossible. The manager noticed the change in her expression. For the first time since he had known her, she seemed truly confident. Not because people were praising her, because she had finally allowed herself to be seen. The businessman eventually stood from his table. Several guests noticed him walking across the room. His destination became obvious. He was heading toward the waitress. The conversations nearby grew quieter. People remembered what had happened earlier. The waitress noticed him approaching as well. For a moment, uncertainty crossed her face. She wasn't angry, but she didn't know what to expect. The businessman stopped a few feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt different from before. Earlier it had been filled with tension. Now it felt reflective. The businessman looked at her. Then he glanced briefly toward the stage. Finally, he spoke. "You were remarkable." The waitress seemed surprised. His voice sounded sincere. There was no arrogance, no sarcasm, just honesty. She thanked him politely. The businessman nodded. Then he looked away for a second before continuing. "I was wrong." The words came quietly, but they carried weight. The nearby guests listened carefully. The businessman sighed. "When you came to our table earlier, I made assumptions." The waitress remained silent. He continued. "I thought I understood who you were." His expression showed genuine regret. "But tonight showed me how little I actually knew." For perhaps the first time in many years, the businessman wasn't speaking from a position of authority. He was speaking as someone who had made a mistake. The waitress listened calmly. She didn't seem interested in making him feel guilty. That only made the moment more powerful. The businessman shook his head. I judged you unfairly. The waitress studied him for a moment. Then she smiled softly, not because the past had disappeared, but because she could see he meant what he was saying. People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them. The businessman extended his hand. She accepted it. Several nearby guests smiled. The moment wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no public embarrassment, just a simple acknowledgement that respect matters. The businessman thanked her again before leaving. As he walked away, he seemed different than when he arrived. Perhaps lighter, perhaps wiser. The waitress watched him go. Then she returned her attention to the remaining guests. The evening eventually came to an end. Tables were cleared. Lights were dimmed. Employees began cleaning and organizing the restaurant. Everyone seemed unusually energized despite the long day. The staff couldn't stop talking about what had happened. You were amazing. I still can't believe that performance. You had the whole room captivated. The waitress laughed shyly. She wasn't used to receiving compliments. The manager approached carrying a phone. You should see this. He showed her several videos already being shared online. Guests had uploaded clips from the performance. Comments were appearing rapidly. People were praising the emotion, the authenticity, the courage. The videos were spreading much faster than anyone expected. The waitress stared at the screen in disbelief. Thousands of people who had never met her were already reacting to the performance. The manager smiled. I have a feeling this is only the beginning. At first, she wasn't sure what he meant. But over the next several hours, his prediction began proving true. The videos continued gaining attention. More comments appeared. More shares followed. People connected with the story. Not because it involved fame. Not because it involved wealth. Because it felt real. A quiet waitress had stepped onto a stage and revealed something beautiful that nobody expected. People love stories like that. Before leaving for the night, the waitress stood alone in the now empty dining room. The stage remained where it had been earlier. The spotlight was turned off. Everything looked normal again. Yet nothing felt normal. Something had changed. Not the restaurant. Not the audience. Her. For the first time in years, she no longer felt invisible. And although she didn't know it yet, the attention from that single performance was about to open doors she never imagined possible. The next morning felt completely different from any other morning in the waitress's life. When she woke up, sunlight was already shining through the apartment window. For a few moments, she lay quietly in bed, wondering if the previous evening had really happened. The standing ovation, the applause, the conversations, the videos, it all felt almost unreal. Then her phone began vibrating. Again, and again, and again. Messages continued appearing from coworkers, customers, and people she hadn't spoken to in years. The performance videos had spread much faster overnight than anyone expected. Thousands of people had already watched them. The number kept growing every hour. The waitress sat up and stared at the screen. Comments were pouring in from people across different cities and even different countries. Many weren't talking only about the performance. They were talking about courage, determination, hope. People connected with her story because they saw parts of themselves in it. Some had overcome disabilities. Others had struggled with confidence. Some had spent years feeling invisible. The messages touched her deeply. One comment read, I've been afraid to follow my dream for years. Watching this gave me courage. Another said, thank you for reminding people that talent comes in many forms. There were hundreds more like it. The waitress never imagined her performance would affect strangers this way. Her mother sat beside her at the kitchen table and watched her read the messages. Tears appeared in her eyes. Not because she was emotional, because she was proud. For years, she had watched her daughter doubt herself. She had watched her hide her gifts from the world. Now the world was finally seeing what she had always known. You deserve this, her mother said softly. The waitress smiled. For the first time in a very long time, she believed those words. Later that day, she arrived at the restaurant for her shift. The moment she walked through the doors, applause erupted from the staff. The waitress froze, then laughed. Several co-workers gathered around her. They congratulated her. Some wanted photos. Others simply wanted to tell her how proud they were. The manager walked over carrying a newspaper. The waitress looked surprised. The manager placed it on a nearby table. A small article about the performance had already appeared. The headline focused on inspiration, perseverance, and hidden talent. The waitress couldn't believe it. Just days earlier, she had been another employee serving tables. Now people were talking about her story. The attention felt strange, but it also felt meaningful. Not because she wanted fame, because the attention was helping people understand an important lesson. You never truly know what someone is capable of. Throughout the week, invitations began arriving. A community center asked whether she would participate in a local event. A charity organization invited her to perform during a fundraiser. A school requested a visit to speak about perseverance and confidence. The waitress was overwhelmed. She never expected any of this. At first, she almost declined every invitation. Standing in front of large groups still made her nervous. But her mother encouraged her. "You don't have to do everything," she said. "But don't hide from opportunities anymore." Those words stayed with her. Eventually, she accepted a few invitations. Each experience helped her confidence grow. People responded warmly everywhere she went. Children were fascinated by her ability to communicate emotion through movement. Parents thanked her for sharing her story. Teachers appreciated the positive message. Every event reminded her that her voice had never depended on speech. Her voice came from who she was. Months passed. Life remained busy. She still worked at the restaurant. She still helped customers. She still lived with the same kindness that had always defined her. But something had changed inside. She no longer viewed herself through the eyes of people who underestimated her. She saw herself differently now. Stronger, more confident, more willing to take chances. The restaurant also benefited from the attention. Customers frequently visited after hearing about the story. Many asked about the waitress whose performance had inspired so many people. Some arrived from neighboring cities. Others came simply because they wanted to support the restaurant and its staff. The manager often smiled when he saw new guests entering. One unexpected decision had changed everything. Then one evening, several months after the performance, something happened that nobody expected. The wealthy businessman returned. The restaurant was busy but not crowded. The waitress noticed him almost immediately. For a brief moment, old memories resurfaced. The criticism, the embarrassment, the difficult evening. Then she remembered everything that followed. The performance, the support, the opportunities, the growth. She no longer felt hurt. She felt grateful. Because without realizing it, that painful moment had pushed her toward something better. The businessman approached the hostess and requested a table. Several staff members recognized him. Word quietly spread through the restaurant. The manager noticed too. He wondered how the evening would unfold. The businessman ate dinner quietly. Unlike his previous visit, he seemed more relaxed, less concerned with impressing people, more focused on simply enjoying the evening. When the meal ended, he stood and walked toward the waitress. Several nearby customers watched curiously. The waitress greeted him politely. The businessman smiled. This time the smile felt genuine. Not forced, not formal, just genuine. "I hoped I'd see you again," he said. The waitress nodded. The businessman took a moment before speaking again. "I wanted another chance to thank you." She looked surprised. He continued, "That night changed something for me." The waitress listened quietly. The businessman looked around the restaurant. "I've spent most of my life focused on success." He paused. "Money, business, reputation." Then he shook his head. "But sometimes those things make people forget what really matters." The waitress understood. The businessman sighed. "When I first met you, I judged you unfairly. His voice carried genuine regret. "I wasn't seeing a person. I was seeing assumptions." The waitress appreciated his honesty. Many people make mistakes. Few are willing to admit them. The businessman smiled. "Your performance reminded me to pay more attention to people instead of appearances." The waitress thanked him. The conversation remained simple, respectful, human. There was no anger, no bitterness, just understanding. Before leaving, the businessman handed the manager a small envelope. Inside was a donation to a local community arts program. He requested that it help people facing challenges pursue creative opportunities. The manager was surprised. So was the waitress. The businessman simply smiled. Then he left. As he walked out of the restaurant, several staff members exchanged glances. People can change. Sometimes they just need the right lesson. The waitress watched him disappear through the doors. Then she returned to work. Another customer needed assistance. Another table needed service. Life moved forward. But the lessons from that unforgettable evening remained. Years later, many people would still remember the story. Not because a wealthy businessman embarrassed a waitress. Not because a video became popular. Not because of applause. They remembered it because it revealed something true about human nature. The people we overlook often carry incredible stories. The quietest person in the room may possess extraordinary strength. The person serving your meal may have a talent the world has never seen. And kindness matters more than status ever will. The waitress eventually performed at many events. She inspired countless people. She helped others believe in themselves. Yet no matter how much recognition she received, she never forgot where it all began. A restaurant, a difficult evening, painful moment, and a decision to step onto a stage despite fear. That single choice changed her life. Because the truth is simple. Her greatest power was never her performance. It was her courage. The courage to keep going when people doubted her. The courage to stay kind when others were unfair. The courage to share her gift with the world. And in the end, that courage spoke louder than any voice ever could. The guests eventually forgot what meals they ordered that night. They forgot the business discussions. They forgot many of the details. But they never forgot the quiet waitress who walked onto a stage, said nothing at all, and somehow left an entire room speechless.